this. Thanks so much in advance. Okay. So the way that I understand this question is, why are we not all just doing what the Rambam wrote and finish, right? I mean, if that's what's appropriate, then that's what's appropriate. So in order to be able to answer that, we have to question, first of all, is that indeed appropriate, right? I mean, why do people think that that's appropriate? So the first thing that I'll say is the basis for considering the question in the first place, I would imagine, lies, right? What's assumed in these questions, I would imagine lies in the difference between the way that HaRambam was posek the halachot in the Mishneh Torah and the way that Maran ben Yosef Karo was posek the halachot in Shulchan Aruch. And there is a very different approach that either is taking, and a very different aim that either is taking. So HaRambam writes clearly that the establishment of his halachot in the Mishneh Torah are simply to take the rulings of the Bet Din of the Rov Hachmei Yisrael, and in some cases the Bet Din HaGadol, that spread to the jurisdiction of the entirety of the people, to put them into legal clarity, right? To say this is the law, because when a person studies Talmud, or the other works of the Hachamim, for that matter, that deal with halakha, it is not straightforward to be able to read it through and be able to know clearly without question what the halakha is. So HaRambam's aim was to distill the halachic decisions, or the halachic conclusions of those aspects into the Mishneh Torah in a clear and orderly form. So that's what he did. So that means that the establishments of HaRambam and Mishneh Torah are what he understood the conclusions of the Talmud to be. And I'm going to emphasize what he understood the conclusions of the Talmud to be. Now, there are those, perhaps I am included in that, although the Rambamniks, the staunch Rambamniks would not include me in their circles, feel very strongly that there are Rambamniks that feel very strongly that there is no alternative to what HaRambam understood, right? If this is how HaRambam understood the sugya, then that is the sugya, and that's it. And there's nothing else to discuss, right? So however it is that the Tosafot might have understood the sugya and the law that came out of it, or the other Rishonim and their studies of the sugyot and how the law came out of it, well, I mean, who's as consistent as HaRambam? Who has written across the board on all of it in a conglomeration as HaRambam has done, in sweeping the entirety of the works of the Hachamim and putting them forth, right? These are the arguments. And the truth of the matter is, these are arguments that have some level of weight. I mean, not that, some will listen to that and say, well, who is Rabbi Dweck to say that it has weight? I mean, it is what it is, and it's supposed to be that we follow it. But nonetheless, for the sake of answering the question, it's important to understand why one would ask this question, from what perspective. And I'm simply explaining how it is that I understand the question, right? Could be that the question wasn't meant in this way, but nonetheless, here's how I'm answering it. So if HaRambam's assertions, right, his conclusions, are his understandings of the halachic conclusions of the sugyot and the Gemara and the Talmud and the other works that he included in the rulings, well, then yes, that's fine, and it's very likely that he had Mesorah for how it is that he studied the sugyot, and very likely that it might have been rooted in the Geonim. Indeed, it's quite clear that much of it was rooted in the Geonim. So it's very hard to be able to negate that. However, as I said, nonetheless, it still comes down to that core point, and that is, it's his opinion, right? And it's his tradition, or it's his learning, or it's his Mesorah, whatever it is that you want to say. But it is still it loses to a degree, right, concrete, indisputable alternatives to how it is at HaRambam. Now, some people would agree that what I just said is not true. No, it is concrete and indisputable. But nonetheless, Rabim V'Gedolim Yisrael did argue and dispute and understand the sugyot differently. And so and for that matter, the Talmud, if it put itself forward and didn't clarify, right, how it is, or there was room for people to err, and significant people might have erred if HaRambam was the only way and they disagreed with HaRambam, well, then the Talmud isn't working, right? There's something missing in it, right? But the alternative is to say that Talmud can be understood in certain areas differently by different Hachamim, and how it is that how they kind of come to the conclusions of the Talmud. Now, what did Maran do? What did Rabbi Yosef Karo do? Rabbi Yosef Karo was concerned about a different issue. He wasn't concerned about distilling the law of the Hachamim into a clear, digestible fashion. Maran was concerned about the diversity of practice and the ripping apart of Klal Yisrael as a result of the multitudinal practices that were going on. So he writes in Akdama of the Bet Yosef, it's no longer 2 Torot because there was complaint in Talmud about Bet Hillel and Ben Shammai that they made the Torah as though it was 2 Torot. It says, no, it's like 10 Torot, more, because everybody's doing a whole bunch of different things. And so what he wanted to do, his aim was to unify practice. So what did Maran do? Maran had an assumption inherent in his work. And the assumption inherent in his work was that there were capacities in the Talmud to understand its conclusions differently, and therefore convened a virtual Bet Din in order to be able to establish the law. So if he's convening a virtual Bet Din in order to establish the law, which is not this Bet Din by manner of its convening by dead people, right, is not responsive and deliberating, right? The deliberations have already happened. They've already rendered their rulings. The Rif Rambam and the Rosh have already rendered their rulings. And so I'm going to choose like 2 out of the 3 if they agree, is what Maran says. And all of that is in order to be able to establish a unified practice. And the only thing that allows Maran to be able to do this really, which is unspoken, is to accept alternative approaches to understanding the Talmud and ruling on them. Right? So now one has 2 options. One can either say that Maran was wrong in that assertion, right? And therefore reject completely the Shulchan Aruch, right? Which is what one would have to do, right? Or accept that Maran was recognized that the Talmud could be interpreted in different ways, not a free-for-all, right? There are rules and systems in which the sugyot and Divrei Hachamim are studied and understood, but nonetheless that there are alternatives, and that those alternatives are valid, right? Now, how do I know which one to choose? So that Maran decided he's going to establish a Bet Din and rule in that way in order to be able to unify practice, and that's how he saw. So as far as I'm concerned, right, Maran is asserting something that I don't see what do you call it, an ironclad argument against. I don't see an ironclad argument against it. And therefore, the next level of the answer to this question is, Ma ya'amad davar, right? What does the Am do? And this concept of Kabbalat Maran, right, that Chacham Ovadia always talks about, Kibalnu Horot Maran. So, well, I mean, it's certainly true to a certain degree, right? I mean, there's no question about the fact that the Adot HaMizrach and the Sfaradim pretty much across the board recognize the Shulchan Aruch perhaps to varying severity or varying intensity as an ultimate or certainly a very high authority in terms of how it is that we follow Halakha nowadays. So especially if Maran writes something in Shulchan Aruch and the majority of people behave in the way that Maran has written in the Shulchan Aruch, I see it appropriate to follow that way if it's the way that your family has done, your community does, and so on and so forth. You as an individual, I would not suggest that you pull yourself away and do only how HaRambam writes to do, if that's how the tzibur does, because the tzibur has basis upon which they act and behave. Now, one might say that, and even Maran writes this. Maran says that, listen, if you had a minhag that you've been practicing before, that, I write the halakha, well, then keep practicing your minhag, right? And you do that as well. These components of the Maya Amad Davar of Klal Yisrael, what does the Am do of Klal Yisrael, is significant. It isn't Chok velo ya'avor, right? It doesn't trump all things. Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's another question over here. Sometimes there's, things that the community does that is against halakha. There's sometimes things that the community does that isn't really appropriate halakha, and that is not strong. The fact that the community does it doesn't mean that it's strong enough in order to be able to push away halakha. So clearly this is going to get into detailed nuance, and it requires a great deal of scholarship in order to be able to have a clear understanding of. But that's why I say what I say. So I hope that explains why I tend to tell people that, yes, of course, they can and should follow Shulchan Aruch in the places that we've accepted Shulchan Aruch, and so to other poskim, I don't think it doesn't. The Torah didn't end with the Shulchan Aruch, right? Also, there's other poskim, there's other ways of ruling. There's new things that come out that we have to be able to follow, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that we need to be able to recognize. I mean, one of the reasons that Maran didn't follow HaRambam directly, which he actually has to address, right, which is important, right? And he doesn't say that I wanted to follow HaRambam because he has the right rulings in the Talmud. He said, I want to follow HaRambam because he's the Posek HaMufursam, right? He's the most well-known. Yeah, but he said there was a gap of 500 years between him and me. So I have to fill in the 500-year gap, and I would have to do a lot of heavy lifting in order to be able to do that. So instead, I'm using the Torah and so on and so forth. So that's why. I will, however, say, and I'm probably going to make people frustrated with this, all of that said, if a person wants to do everything that is written by HaRambam according to HaRambam, I think that person is allowed to do that, and not only allowed, by all means, a person can follow that. Right? Would I suggest it lechatechila? No. But if a person came and asked me, I'm determined, that's what I want to do. Can I do that? Yes, a person can do that. But I would say the same with Shulchan Aruch. If a person wanted to follow Shulchan Aruch across the board and do exactly what Maran writes in Shulchan Aruch, I think that person has the allowance to do so, if that's what they choose to do. But that is not obligated. It is not something a person must do. And there is a reason why Klal Yisrael in general developed the way that it developed. And I think, and I will say, and this may end up being with another question, that although, like I said, it is not ironclad and Chok V'lo Ya'avor, what the general faithful population of Klal Yisrael does is not to be taken lightly. And I'll explain why later.